Hi everyone, my name's Jordan and welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing my March wrap-up. As you guys know, my February was kind of a bummer. I didn't read anything that I super loved. I had some good books in there, but they were none of them were like new favorites, and I was kind of in a slump, so I didn't read that many books either. So March I kind of made up for it. I read a few bangers in there. I read some good books. I read some not so good books. So without further ado, let's get into it. First up, I read Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King. This is like a collection of, I think it's like 2 novellas and 3 short stories or something like that. And it was kind of hit or miss for me. The first novella I liked, and then some of the other like short stories I felt like they were kind of pointless almost, like they were kind of like slice of life and just ended. Like there was nothing that really happened. So overall the book was okay. I read it because it was recommended as one of the like must read before reading The Dark Tower, and I'm trying to like get back into The Dark Tower. I don't know how prevalent this collection is. I didn't notice anything that like jumped out at me, but I was listening to it, so I might have just like missed something. Overall it was okay. Some of the novellas or short stories were better than others. That's like most anthologies, so overall it was okay. Next I read The Conspirator by Veronica Roth. This is like a short story that is a retelling of Antigone, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. I read this at the beginning of the month and I don't remember a whole lot about it, but I'll tell you I did remember a whole lot about it directly after finishing it. It wasn't a bad book by any means, it just didn't really mesh with it. It wasn't super memorable for me. It was okay. I can't even remember like the premise and what the retelling was, besides that it was about Antigone. So not a bad book, not anything great. Next I read The Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. This is a sci-fi time travel story and I really enjoyed it. It was shorter. I listened to the audiobook. It was really enjoyable. The twist at the end I could not see coming. I find time travel sci-fi kind of hit or miss for me. Sometimes I love it, sometimes I hate it, and here it really worked. I think because it was shorter and it was more about the themes and everything than about the science of the time travel. So overall it was really enjoyable. It highlighted the dangers of time travel and things like that while also showing some of the things that can come out of it. So overall I really liked this one. The characters, for it being such a short book, were fun to read about. They were fun to be with. So yeah, a good book. I understand why it won a bunch of awards. It may seem like I'm going through a lot of these really fast, but it's because a lot of these first books I read in March were all really fast audiobooks. Because I was in a slump in February, I was trying to get through a bunch of small books so that I could get out of the slump. So I'm only talking about them briefly because they're all really short. So I have some bigger ones later that I will get a little more in depth in. Next I have The Jade Setter of Loon by Fonda Lee. This is a prequel novella set in the Greenbone universe, and it was a lot of fun. It was tangentially related to the main story. Like we saw some characters that we knew from the main story, but for the most part this was a separate story from the family and everything. Like we didn't follow a family member. They came in at certain points, but like they weren't the main focus of the book. I found this really just enjoyable. I listened to it before we did our Greenbone Saga live stream over on Alex on Tall Guy Reads channel, which was super fun. Go check that out. I'll link it down below. But I just really liked being back in this world, and it further cemented that I really need to do a reread soon. I'm going to try the audiobooks because I think I'm going to like these books even more the second time through. Next up is a DNF. I DNF'd Sister Monster Maiden by Lucy A. Snyder. This is a like horror novel that I didn't have any like huge issues with. I was just bored with it. It was about this like virus that goes around that basically makes people into zombies, and there's a lot of body horror involved, which didn't bother me. Body horror normally doesn't bother me. I just wasn't really gripped by the story, and it felt a little too close to home because like it was set in this world, so these people were still recovering from COVID-19, and then this new virus comes around, and it was a little too close to home. I didn't really want to like read that kind of setting. So not a bad book. I think in a different time I would have probably liked it a lot, but didn't work for me this time. So I DNF'd it. Next up, I have Dead House Gates by Steven Erikson. This is the second book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen series. I am co-hosting a read-along of this series over with Alex on Tall Guy Reads, Josh from Red Fury Books, and Ian from Ian the Reader. And we will be doing our live discussion of this book sometime in April. I think we have scheduled it. I just can't think of the date off the top of my head, but I will share a post as we get closer to this live show. I'm super excited to talk about this book with everyone. I really liked this second book. I can't decide which one I liked more. I feel like I had a little bit more emotional connection with the characters in Gardens of the Moon, but this one was definitely a little more fast-paced, and the ending was buck wild. I will say I've seen a lot of people say that Gardens of the Moon was harder to grasp, and then Deadhouse Gates they liked more because they were able to follow along better. I found this one more confusing because we were trying to remember certain characters from the first book, as well as these new characters that were introduced, and I kept forgetting if we had already seen those characters in Gardens of the Moon because there's just so many characters. I was still having a hard time grasping at the beginning what side everyone was on. Since I couldn't really tell what allegiance a lot of the people had, I had a hard time understanding motivations, but about the halfway point I really started to get a grasp on what was going on, and then the last like 150 pages of this book were absolutely wild. I will say a lot of people say that like this book is super emotional, and like people were saying like get your tissues ready and things like that. I didn't find it very emotional, and I think it's because I didn't have that like super attachment to the characters. I don't really have that yet with this series, which to me is when I decide that a series is my favorite series. When I say that like a series is one of my favorite series of all time, a lot of times it's because I had a really emotional connection with the characters. So I'm hoping that as we go on with these characters and the story that I do get that deeper connection with the characters, because so far these are incredibly well written. They're super exciting. They're super fun, but I don't really feel that attachment to anyone yet. So overall, this was a very, very, very well crafted book. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I just wish I had a little bit more attachment to the characters. I will say, seeing a lot of the other people that are reading this book right now and how different the reactions are, I feel like this series suffers from the hype because people go into each book with these preconceived notions that other people have given to them, and it really influences their reading experience. So I really liked this book, and if I hadn't known that a lot of people thought the ending was really emotional, I wouldn't be comparing their feelings to mine. Like I wouldn't have even been like, oh, but I didn't feel super emotional at the end like everyone else. Like if I hadn't known that, I probably would have liked this book more. So I think that kind of like prepping people for how they're going to feel about the series is maybe to your detriment if you want the people to like the series. Again, I'm loving the series. I think it's really, really fun. The preconceived notions I've had, and I've seen it with other readers as well, have kind of tainted my reading experience. However, I don't think I know a whole lot about the following books. I think the first two I've heard a lot more about than the following. So I'm hoping I go into those a little more blind so that I don't have those I don't have other people's opinions influencing mine. Next, I read Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. This was recommended to me by Kyle over on Read by Kyle because I asked him to give me some memoir recommendations because he reads a lot of memoirs. And this one was really fun. It was a really unique memoir, unlike anything I've read before. It was kind of the author took a historical figure, this scientist that studied fish, and kind of goes into how her learning about him and his studies kind of helped influence her life and how she lived her life and kind of gave her certain purposes when she felt like she had none. But then her coming to terms with some of the like really awful things this scientist did and kind of how her opinion on him has evolved over time. It was a really, really interesting take on someone's life. She was using his life to kind of tell the story of her life, and it was just really interesting, really fun, and you could really tell how her passions like shone through as she talked about the history of this man and his science and everything like that. And it was a really, really entertaining book. I highly recommend it. Next, I read Ghost Boy by Martin Pistorius. This is another memoir about a young boy who all of a sudden his body started degenerating, and then he went into a 3-year coma, and then he was unresponsive for about 12 years, I believe. Maybe it was 9 years, a long time. There was a long time where he was aware in his body, but he couldn't move or respond to anyone. So he was being taken care of by his family in the evenings and on the weekends, and he was in a care facility during the day. And he kind of talks about the horrors he faced there, but also just like the day-to-day dehumanization that he experienced, basically having to be taken care of, never getting to have an opinion on what you eat, how you're positioned, what you're wearing, how you sleep, like just all of these small day-to-day things that we take for granted. He could not decide for himself because no one even knew that he was aware. They knew he was awake, they just didn't realize that he was aware of what was going on. So he was just trapped inside his mind for a long time. And then there was like one nurse that noticed that he was trying to kind of communicate with her with his eyes, and then he slowly starts to get some mobility back in his body, and you kind of just learn how he starts communicating with his family and with his caregivers and all of this other things. And it's a really, really beautiful but also terrifying story of survival and inhumane things a lot of caregivers do to people that they think can't respond. So overall, it was a great memoir. I highly recommend it. Next, I read Golden Sun by Pierce Brown. This is the second book in the Red Rising saga. I think that Golden Sun was infinite times better than Red Rising. Red Rising I liked, but I didn't love. I found a lot of it I really didn't enjoy. I just thought the premise was there, which is why I decided to continue on with the series. And Golden Sun was buck wild. My biggest complaint with Golden Sun is it is so fast-paced that I almost needed some more breathing room. Like, I felt like we would have an action scene and then it would end, and then we would time jump to another action scene, and it was just constant movement. And I felt like I was getting whiplash. Like, I wanted some moments for it to slow down. So overall, it was very good. The ending I did not see coming at all. I think Darrow was much less annoying than I found him in Red Rising, because in Red Rising I thought he was the worst. I thought he was so annoying, and he's much easier to read from in Golden Sun. The plot was better. We didn't have the annoying like Hunger Games thing. Like, it was overall just a much better book, and now I'm really excited for Morningstar. I will say it got very dark, and I've heard that this series just gets darker and darker, so I'm a little nervous for that, because sometimes dark stories I love, like Sun Eater, but sometimes it can get too dark and then I just don't enjoy it. So I'm hoping that we toe that line without getting too far. Next up, I read Fool's Assassin by Robin Hobb. This is the first book in the Fitz and the Fool trilogy, which is the last trilogy in the Realm of the Elderlings. This book, it might be my new favorite Realm of the Elderlings book. I'm not sure yet. It is stunning. It is absolutely fantastic. There's another huge time jump from the last Fitz series we had, which was the Tawny Man trilogy. We have a huge time jump from the end of the Tawny Man trilogy to this. Yeah. And the direction this story went in was way different than I thought it was going to be. There was so much that happened that I just did not expect at all. It was so beautifully written. And honestly, until the last chunk of the book, not a whole lot happened. Like, it was a very slow-paced slice of life book of Fitz and him just trying to figure out what his life is now. And I can't get into too much more without spoiling a lot from previous series, but this book was just beautiful. It's a chunker. This whole last series is really large, but I read this so quick because I just couldn't put it down. It's so easy to read while also being like, the prose is just really beautiful. And even though it was slow, I didn't mind because I loved every minute we spent with Fitz and in his mind and getting to kind of see his life where he is now. It was just so beautiful. Honestly, in my top 3 probably favorite books in the Realm of the Elderlings. Probably once I'm finished with the whole series, I'll do a tier ranking. But for right now, we'll just say this is in the top 3. It's up there. I had such a good time with this. Next up, I read Mask of Mirrors, the first book in the Rook and the Rose trilogy or series by M.A. Carrick. I'm not sure if it's a trilogy, actually. It could be a series. I'm not sure. There's 2 books out so far, and this is the first one. I really enjoyed this. It is an adult fantasy story that is about this like young thief who infiltrates one of the like big families within this city to try to just get money from them and things like that. And this world is so interesting and the characters were really great. There was a lot of like plot manipulation and there was a lot of characters that interacted in interesting ways. There were a lot of unknowns throughout a lot of the story, and those reveals at the end were really rewarding. Overall, I really liked this book. I'm excited for the second one. I haven't heard a whole lot about the second book, whether it's good or not. So I'm gonna go into it blind and hope I love it, because this was a very, very strong beginning to a series. Next up, I read Kindred by Octavia Butler. This is one of the 12 books recommended to me by 12 booktubers, and this one was recommended to me by Joanna. I will link her channel down below. Thank you, Joanna, for recommending this to me, because this was a fantastic book. I honestly knew next to nothing going into it. This is a time travel story about a woman in the 80s, I believe. I'm pretty sure it's the 80s. I think it's the 80s. And she all of a sudden gets transported back in time to the early 1800s, where slavery is still legal. And she realizes that her life is tied to this young boy's, who is the son of a slave owner, and she always has an indeterminate amount of time stuck in this world, and when she gets back to her time, only a little bit of time has passed. So she could spend months back in time, and when she comes back, it's only been a few hours. So she's married to a white man, so there's a lot of like discussions about their interracial relationship and the way it's impacting this whole traveling back in time thing. I will say, if you're going into this to really get a grasp on the time travel and all of that, it is not ever really explained. It's not the point of the story. The point of the story is the exploration of being Black in America in two different times in history, and it is definitely not, the focus is not the time travel. So like, don't go into this thinking this is like a super well thought out magic system with time travel. Like, it is not that. But it was a harrowing read. I listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook was phenomenal. This should be required reading in schools, because you learn a lot about history, and you learn a lot about the nuance of the situations that people were in. Like, in some aspects, it is very black and white, the evils that were done and are still being done. But there is also a lot of nuance to a lot of the situations that were going on. And Octavia Butler does a really fantastic job of highlighting that nuance while also showing the cruelty of a system in place that is immoral. So overall, fantastic book. I have not read one Octavia Butler book that is bad. Granted, I've only read 2, but I really am hoping to read her entire backlist, because so far they've all been great. Next up is a short story. I read The Six Deaths of the Saint by Alex E. Harrow, and it is a beautiful story. It is like 26 pages long or something. Like, it is tiny, but the amount of like emotional impact we got in this tiny book was incredible. And I highly recommend you go read it. There's like a whole series of these short stories written by a bunch of different authors. And this is the one I'd always seen people like raving about. So I read it, and they were right. It's so good. I like teared up at the end, and it was literally only 26 pages. So I highly recommend it. I don't want to get into what it's about because it's short. Next up is my second DNF of March, and that is Wrath by John Gwynne. This is the last book in the Faithful and the Fallen series. I was buddy reading this series with Alex on Tall Guy Reads and Kyle from Read by Kyle, and they finished it because they're stronger than me. But I couldn't, guys. I really, really did not like this series. There were certain aspects that I found very strong. There were some things I did really like. Like, this whole series was not trash. The whole thing was not unenjoyable. There were definitely some highlights and some things I liked. However, it is so repetitive, and the things that were repeated were not entertaining to me. And it felt like there were no stakes because the stakes were so high. I don't know if that makes sense. What I mean is, because there was so much death, like so many people die, it's constantly somebody new is dying. I just didn't care, because I was like, they could die at any minute. I don't care. And the battles were repetitive. So many of them had no impact on the plot. They were just there. I didn't feel super connected to any character. Anytime something emotional happened to one of the characters, I shrugged it off. Like, I just really did not feel any connection to the characters. I will say John Gwynne is really, really great at his battle scenes. Like, the battles were really well written for the ones that were important. There was just too many of them. It's the ultimate fantasy story of a chosen one versus the ultimate evil, and I think the concept is really great. It's all there. It's got some very stereotypical fantasy tropes that are, some of them are kind of turned on their head, but overall it was just boring. I was just bored. I just didn't care. So I DNF'd it. I don't think I'll be coming back to it. I'll probably unhaul this series at some point. I wish I had loved it because I know that so many people love this series, and I wish I also did. Next up, I read Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee. I got this arc from the publisher, so thank you to Tor.com for this arc. This is a little novella by Fonda Lee, who wrote the Greenbone Saga, who I mentioned earlier. This was not really what I was expecting, and I wasn't expecting a lot because I didn't know a whole lot about it going into it, but it read a little younger than I thought it would. It is classified as adult fantasy, but it kind of feels a little YA, and I think that might be because the premise of this story is similar to another series I read that I can't think of the name of right now, but it's about Phoenix Riders, and it's a YA story, and it's a really great trilogy. And this kind of has a similar vibe. There are these people that are basically like rock trainers. I have no idea if I'm saying that right. It's these big birds. They are their trainers, and they work with them to basically hunt, and their goal is to protect villages from a bunch of different monsters out in the world. While the story was fun and entertaining, I had the same problem I have with a lot of novellas, and it's just that they're too short. I don't get enough time to really get connected to the characters, so I never really felt like any emotional impact towards it. The story was fun. It was an enjoyable read. I think I read it in like 1 or 2 sittings. It was fun. It just didn't really leave an impression on me. Next up, I read The Adventures of Amina AlSarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. I loved this book. I've seen some mixed reviews on it. This was perfect. It was just what I wanted. I love S.A. Chakraborty. I love the Davabad trilogy, and this was no exception. This is her first book outside of Davabad, and it was phenomenal. It is about an older woman who is like a retired pirate, and she has a daughter now, and she's kind of like living in seclusion with her daughter, just trying to keep her safe. A desperate grandmother comes to her door and asks her to go rescue her granddaughter, who has been stolen by a foreigner. And so Amina at first says no, but then this woman offers her a huge chunk of money to do it. And Amina has been down on her luck. She's been really struggling to support her and her daughter, so she says, okay, I'll take this one last job. But it becomes a lot darker and a lot scarier than she anticipated, and it becomes very dangerous, and she crosses paths with a lot of like really, really scary people from her past, as well as people that she's never interacted with before. And overall, it was just a stunning book. It was funny. I really loved all the characters. The found family she has with her crewmates, as well as her actual family, was really beautifully written, and there were a lot of discussions about like sexuality and religion and all of this stuff that was just really impactful to me. There is also like a really cute reveal at the end. It's not like a huge reveal by any means, like it's not like a huge game changer, but it was so sweet that I teared up. I didn't see it coming at all. Overall, I really liked this book. I'll probably reread it soon because I did really, really like it, and it's probably one of my favorite books of the year so far. So wonderful book. So excited for more in this series. I hope we get one sooner rather than later, but I do know that Shannon Chakraborty has been kind of going through some health issues, so I will give her the time she needs to write the second one, but I am very excited for when that does come out. Next up, I read Exile by R.A. Salvatore. This is the second book in the Legend of Drizzt series. This is an omnibus of the first 3 books, so I read the second one. These books are just so fun. They're set in the D&D world of the Forgotten Realms, and they are just classic fantasy. They're quick reads, they're all pretty short, and they have very standard tropes, but they have really rich settings, and the characters are really interesting to read about. And we're finally getting out of the Underdark at the end of Exile. Drizzt was leaving the Underdark, so we're going above ground. I'm really excited for that. Overall, these are just classic fantasy stories that are perfect like palate cleansers between some really heavier books or just really big books. They're short, they're fun. I highly recommend them. Next up, I read Bitter Medicine by Mia Tsai. I had this arc from NetGalley that I did not read before it came out, so I listened to the audiobook, and it was good. It was a adult fantasy romance story that was entertaining, but definitely not amazing. The magic system was never really explained. There were a lot of terms used that we just never really learned what they were. The romance was a little insta-love, too bad, but a little bit. It was there a little bit. I never really got fully connected to the characters, but I did find it very entertaining. I kept wanting to listen to it. It was just a fun read. Wasn't anything amazing, but it wasn't bad. Sometimes you just need a quick, easy easy, fun read, and this was that. Last but not least, I read How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. This is a new horror story by Grady Hendrix. I've never read any of their books before, and this one was okay. I think that I should stop listening to horror novels because I think listening to horror audiobooks keeps me from being scared. So a lot of the horror elements have felt kind of just silly. To be fair, this one is about a house that is haunted by dolls. So if it's not scary, it's going to be silly because it's a bunch of child toys coming alive. Overall, the horror aspects did not really scare me, but again, I think if I read it physically, it would feel scarier. I'm not sure. The characters were insufferable at the beginning. Like, I did not enjoy reading from them. I almost DNF'd the book because they sucked, but by the end, I did come around to them. I found the discussions on family and loss and everything were really well done, even if the horror elements didn't stick with me that much. The desperation that the characters felt throughout this whole story was really well portrayed. I found it really well crafted. So overall, this was a really fun book. I want to read more horror, but I want to try to do horror physically because I just don't think audiobook horror works for me. I just don't find it scary sitting at my desk at work listening to a horror book. And that is all the books I read in March. It is a beefy list, and it is a good list. I read a bunch of good books. April is stacking up to be a bunch of chunkers. I'm going on a 2-week trip to Japan in May, so I'm trying to kick out a bunch of reading in April because I'm not going to get a lot of reading done in May. I do want to do a travel vlog. I want to do a vacation vlog. I've never done one before, so we'll see how well I'm able to stick to it, but I'm hoping I can do that coming up soon. This month, I've got a readathon going on. I've got a bunch of buddy reads. It's a really jam-packed month, so I'm going to be doing a lot of reading. Thank you guys for watching. If you could please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know down below what your favorite book in March was, and I know a lot of people were going through a reading slump in February, and if you were, did you get out of it? If you really like my content, you can hit the notification bell to be notified every time I post new videos. I also have a Patreon now, which I will link down below. There are some special benefits such as voting for a book for my TBR and patron exclusive reading sprints, so check that out down below. Thank you guys for your support. Of course, it means the world to me, and until next time, thank you guys.